The plane hadn't even taken off when the damage was done. Eloise Winters, a 68-year-old black woman dressed in her Sunday best, stood frozen at the threshold of the first-class cabin. The flight attendant didn't smile. She didn't apologize. She simply said, "You'll be more comfortable in the back." The words struck like ice. Eloise clutched her boarding pass, a paid first-class ticket bought by her son, Marcus Winters, the CEO of a $12 billion tech firm. But the crew had already made their judgment, not based on her seat number, but on her skin. 20 minutes later, the plane was grounded, the jetway reconnected, and every camera on the tarmac was pointed at Marcus as he stepped aboard. The flight crew didn't know who she was, but they were about to find out exactly what it meant to humiliate the mother of a man who built his empire on justice and didn't believe in second chances. Because today wasn't just about one seat, it was about every door ever slammed shut in silence. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Long before he was CEO, Marcus Winters was a boy with holes in his shoes and brilliance in his eyes. He was raised on Chicago's South Side by a woman who scrubbed floors at dawn and studied spelling words with him by dusk. Eloise Winters didn't raise her son to chase power. She raised him to understand what it meant to hold it and, more importantly, when to use it. She had no corporate title, no stock portfolio, no access to boardrooms. But her resolve was titanium. Marcus never forgot the late nights when Eloise would wrap ice in a towel for her aching joints after a double shift and still find the strength to quiz him on algebra problems. She didn't have time for rest, but she made time for dreams his. By the time Marcus was 13, he was coding games on public library computers. By 19, he had secured a full scholarship to MIT. There, he often found himself being the only black student in a room full of future billionaires. No one ever said it aloud, but their eyes did. He didn't look the part. It was the same look Eloise received just hours ago, standing at the check-in desk with a valid first-class ticket and nowhere to sit. After MIT, Marcus turned down jobs at Fortune 100 firms to build something of his own. He founded a data analytics startup with $2,000 and a second-hand server working out of his friend's garage. For 3 years, he survived on ramen noodles and 20-hour days. But his algorithm, a predictive engine that helped major retailers eliminate billions in losses, changed everything. Investors came knocking. Then came the merger with Pinnacle Technologies. At just 37, he became one of the youngest CEOs of a company listed on the S&P 500. Despite his suit collection, private driver, and penthouse office, Marcus never became distant from the pain of the past. He knew exactly how fast corporate smiles could curdle into suspicion. He had sat through board meetings where his ideas were ignored until repeated by someone whiter. And he had watched his mother, even in retirement, be called Miss, with that peculiar tone of condescension reserved only for women of her age and color. So when he gifted Eloise the trip to Paris for her 68th birthday, a first-class seat luxury suite full itinerary, it wasn't just a present, it was a promise that she could finally feel the weight of dignity she had long deserved. The morning of the flight, Marcus was pulled into an emergency boardroom crisis. A major client was threatening to walk over a cybersecurity breach. The deal was worth hundreds of millions, and only Marcus had the relationships to contain the fire. As he kissed his mother's forehead, he promised, "I'll meet you at the gate." Eloise smiled. "Handle your business. I'll be waiting." She never saw her son before takeoff. Instead, she saw Vanessa Whitfield, the veteran flight attendant whose practiced smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and the supervisor, Bradley Kent, who didn't ask questions, just blocked her path. Together, they crafted a scenario out of every black elder's nightmare bureaucracy laced with judgment policy deployed like a shield against apology. Eloise had been here before, not on a plane, but in 1,000 moments just like this one. Being followed in stores, ignored at counters, spoken to slower, louder, as if language was the issue, not assumption. She had survived all of it with her head high, but this one hurt more. because this time she had done everything right. She had the right ticket, the right outfit, the right attitude, and yet she was still being told without words that she didn't belong. So when she finally made it onto the plane, only to be told she'd been downgraded, Eloise didn't argue. She texted her son and waited. It wasn't long. As the aircraft began to taxi, a directive came from the tower. Return to gate 32 immediately. Potential maintenance concern, the captain announced vaguely. Back inside the terminal, Marcus Winters was already at the gate, flanked by security and a regional manager who had no idea she was about to be professionally dismantled in front of a full flight crew and 24 camera phones. He walked onto the plane like he owned it because he did in spirit, if not in paperwork. Eloise rose from her seat when she saw him, heartful eyes wet. "I'm fine," she whispered. But Marcus wasn't. This wasn't just personal. It was systemic. Captain Hayes attempted to intercept him. Vanessa hurried down from the front cabin. But Marcus didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply played the recording of his call with corporate, complete with dismissive replies and veiled insults, and let the facts speak for themselves. Passengers listened. Phones filmed. Vanessa and Hayes shifted uneasily under the weight of consequence. And then Marcus looked directly at the captain and said the words that would shift the fate of an entire airline. "You can fix this now, or explain it to the world tomorrow." The silence that followed Marcus' words was deafening. Captain Hayes blinked slowly, realizing he was no longer in charge, not truly. The title on his badge might have said pilot, but the man standing in front of him controlled the altitude of this airline's future. Vanessa, still clutching her flight manifest, attempted a rehearsed smile. "Let's move your mother to first class immediately," she offered, her voice honeyed now. "There's no reason to escalate this further." Eloise looked at Marcus, but he shook his head gently. "Not anymore," he said. "We're not just moving her. We're moving policy." Sandra Wells, the regional manager, rushed aboard the aircraft seconds later. Her expression was equal parts panic and professionalism. "Mr. Winters," she said breathlessly, "I'd like to personally apologize on behalf of Atlantic Airways for the misunderstanding. I assure you this was not our intention." "It was your culture," Marcus corrected calmly, "not your mistake. And culture is the result of leadership." Sandra froze. In the cabin, the passengers sat silently, eyes fixed on the confrontation. Some nodded, a few recorded. Everyone understood something profound was happening. This wasn't just a man defending his mother. This was the invisible wall cracking. "I've terminated all corporate bookings with your airline," Marcus announced to Sandra, loud enough for the passengers and crew to hear. "Effective immediately. You've lost $30 million in annual revenue because someone couldn't imagine a black woman in first class." Sandra paled. "Let's not be hasty," Ma'am Marcus interrupted. "I was patient for decades. This is clarity, not haste." He turned to Captain Hayes. "You threatened to remove her for asking a question. You said federal regulations were at risk. Tell me where in those regulations does it say paid first-class passengers must surrender their dignity on command?" The captain, red-faced, now fumbled for an answer. I was following crew reports." "And your crew was following bias," Marcus said sharply. "That's how systems work. One lie at a time." Eloise placed a hand on her son's arm. "Marcus," she whispered, "you've made your point." "No, Mom," he replied. "I haven't made change yet." From the back of the aircraft, a slow clap began. It was Noah, a college student seated in row 22, who had recorded most of the earlier incident and uploaded it. "He's not yelling. He's not threatening," Noah said aloud. "He's just holding the line." One by one, other passengers joined in, not wildly, not theatrically, just an echo of respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vanessa attempted over the intercom, her voice faltering, "we'd like to offer complimentary beverages during the delay." The move felt desperate. Marcus turned back to Sandra. "Here's what's going to happen. My mother and I are disembarking this aircraft. You're going to transfer our itinerary to a new airline business class or above." You're also going to explain to the media what happened here. Not just that you apologize, but why it happened in the first place. Sandra's face tightened. Mr. Winters, our legal team will be very busy, Marcus finished. Trust me, they already know. I'm forwarding all of this to my firm's in-house counsel, and the press release is already drafted. Captain Hayes stepped forward again, quieter this time. Sir, may I apologize directly to your mother? Eloise stood, dignified, centered. You may, she said softly. The captain removed his hat. Mrs. Winters, I was wrong, deeply wrong. I see that now. I let my assumptions override fairness. I'm sorry. Eloise regarded him a long moment before nodding. You can't fix it with words, Captain. But you can remember this moment the next time a passenger doesn't look like you. Vanessa remained silent. She was no longer acting. She was just exposed. Sandra tried again. Mr. Winters, is there any way we can resolve this quietly? Marcus looked past her into the cabin full of people who had just seen how discrimination operates in a smile in silence, in seat assignments that are anything but accidental. No, he said, we resolve it publicly, because quiet is where it survives. Outside the jet bridge, reporters were already assembling. The tweet Marcus sent while en route had gone viral, shared by journalists, celebrities, and civil rights groups alike. The hashtag Justice for Eloise was trending in 11 countries. It wasn't just about a mother in her seat anymore. It was about every small indignity Black passengers had swallowed for years. As Marcus and Eloise stepped off the plane, security tried to form a path through the crowd, but it was unnecessary. The people parted on their own, reverently letting them pass. Flashbulbs erupted. Microphones reached. Mr. Winters, what will you do next? Marcus paused only briefly. We're going to Paris, he said, but not before we make sure no other mother gets treated like mine again. By the time Marcus and Eloise reached the arrivals concourse, the airport had transformed into a press battleground. A wave of cameras, reporters, and bystanders surged toward them. Flashes popped. Questions fired like hailstones. Mr. Winters, what legal steps are you planning? Did your mother face racial profiling? Do you believe this is systemic? Marcus didn't flinch. He gently guided Eloise toward the black car, waiting at the curb, its driver holding the door open with nervous anticipation. He turned once before stepping in, faced the cameras, and delivered a single sentence. This isn't a scandal, it's a signal. Then he closed the door. Inside the car, Eloise sat silently clutching her handbag. She hadn't asked for any of this. She just wanted to visit Paris. I'm sorry it turned into all this, she said quietly. Marcus shook his head. No, Mama. I'm sorry it took this long to matter. Within hours, the footage from the aircraft Noah's live stream and Marcus's tweet were compiled into a viral news story. Cable news anchors debated corporate racism. TikTok creators stitched together breakdowns of the timeline. By evening, an impromptu protest had begun forming outside Atlantic Airways' regional office in Atlanta. Meanwhile, at Pinnacle Technologies headquarters, Diana Chen was mobilizing. She called an emergency executive meeting, distributed an internal statement of support, and prepared to shield Marcus from backlash. The board wasn't thrilled with the abrupt contract termination, but Diana reminded them that Marcus had acted within his executive authority under the ethics clause. What mattered now was optics and survival. That night, Marcus drafted a personal statement. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't lawyered up or sanitized. It was a letter to his staff, to his peers, to anyone who ever doubted that small acts of bias mattered. I am the product of a woman who cleaned boardrooms before she could ever sit in one. Today, she was reminded that respect is not guaranteed even when it's paid for. We will no longer pretend that discrimination is too complex to confront. The truth is, it's just too convenient to ignore. Not anymore. The post went live at midnight. By sunrise, it had been reposted by thousands of business leaders, civil rights activists, and even airline competitors who saw a chance to publicly distance themselves from Atlantic Airways. Within 24 hours, the airline's stock dropped 11%. Internal sources leaked emails showing executives scrambling to control the narrative, frantically issuing talking points, and instructing staff to avoid the word racial. But the damage was done. Senator Valerie Brooks, chair of the Transportation Oversight Committee, issued a formal statement calling for an investigation into discriminatory practices in the airline industry. If a black woman with a first-class ticket can be denied dignity, then we need to ask how deep this pattern goes, she wrote. Marcus hadn't asked for legislation, but it was coming anyway. Meanwhile, Eloise refused to hide. When reporters arrived at her home for interviews, she stepped out onto the porch in a simple navy sweater, her posture steady. "I've been looked down on my whole life," she said to one camera. "The only difference now is someone finally looked back on my behalf." She became an unlikely symbol, not loud, not angry, just tired of shrinking to make others comfortable. At Atlantic Airways, the internal fallout intensified. Employees began leaking stories of similar incidents, each more damning than the last. A black woman denied lounge access despite her platinum status. A Hispanic family told to prove they paid for business class. A Muslim man flagged as suspicious for requesting a seat change. The PR team was overwhelmed. The board convened an emergency session. Edward Richmond, the airline's CEO, tried to frame the incident as a one-off misunderstanding, but even his own leadership team began to distance themselves. The following Monday, Marcus received an invitation to speak before the Senate hearing on transportation equity. At first, he declined. He didn't want to become a figurehead. He didn't want to be anyone's symbol. But then Eloise said something that changed his mind. "You always say dignity shouldn't depend on who's watching. But sometimes, son, it needs someone watching to finally be seen." So Marcus accepted. At the hearing, he sat beside lawyer scholars and former airline staff. When his turn came to speak, he didn't bring graphs or spreadsheets. He brought the torn boarding pass. This, he said, holding it up, is what discrimination looks like. Not in violence, not in slurs, in small, quiet decisions made by people who believe they're protecting comfort. But what they're protecting is power. The hearing room went silent. It didn't go viral, it went institutional. By the end of the week, Congress had drafted a bill proposing mandatory bias reporting for all federally regulated transportation entities. Lobbyists scrambled. Airline associations issued vague promises to review best practices. But for once, the tide was turning, not just in headlines, but in halls of power. Back at home, Eloise received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from the airline. It was from a woman in Kansas City who had watched the hearing and written by hand, "I've never seen someone like me stand up like that. Thank you. You gave us back something we forgot we had a voice." Eloise folded the letter neatly, then placed it in the same envelope as her boarding pass. Not for bitterness, for remembrance, because now everyone was watching. 3 days after Marcus's Senate testimony, the Office of Civil Aviation Compliance launched a formal inquiry into Atlantic Airways passenger practices. What was once labeled an isolated misunderstanding had grown teeth. With national media attention, a pending class action lawsuit, and a CEO turned whistleblower in Marcus Winters, the pressure was no longer containable. But inside Atlantic Airways, denial still ruled the air. In a sterile boardroom on the 42nd floor of the airline's headquarters, CEO Edward Richmond paced. The latest shareholder report lay untouched on the conference table. Losses had accelerated. Corporate partners were suspending deals. Executives were in damage control. And yet Richmond's jaw was tight with indignation. "He blindsided us," Richmond muttered. "Over one passenger. One seat." "It wasn't one seat," muttered Gabriela Reyes, head of corporate communications. "It was every seat that ever came with a bead of humiliation." Richmond shot her a look, but said nothing. Across the city at Pinnacle Technologies, Marcus was preparing for his next move. Not a press conference, not a lawsuit, a purchase. "I'm buying a stake," he told Diana as they reviewed shareholder data. "Atlantic Airways is vulnerable. I want a seat at their table, literally." "You want on the board?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. No, he said, sliding a folder across to her. I want the board. The folder contained his planned strategic acquisition through private equity leverage, pooled with several ethical investment groups that had been quietly courting Marcus for months. Together, they would accumulate a controlling stake in the airline, then force policy reforms from within. This wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a moral extraction. While the deal gained momentum behind closed doors, Atlantic Airways was hemorrhaging goodwill publicly. Social media campaigns demanding accountability surged. The hashtag first class justice trended for a full week. Passengers with similar experiences flooded inboxes demanding apologies or threatening lawsuits. And still, the airline's official statements remain vague, filled with phrases like re-examination, staff sensitivity, and isolated errors. But Marcus knew the truth: no policy could fix what culture had normalized. The next public flashpoint arrived unexpectedly. During a televised town hall on transportation equity, a former Atlantic flight attendant named Charles McNeil stepped forward. With trembling hands, he read a resignation letter aloud on national television. For 2 years, I watched colleagues question passengers who looked like me. I watched supervisors label assertive customers as aggressive when they were simply tired of being ignored. I filed complaints. Nothing changed. Today I resigned because silence is complicity, and I've been silent too long. The moment electrified the broadcast. The next morning, Marcus received a private message from McNeil. I thought I was alone. Thanks for proving I wasn't. Meanwhile, at the airline's HQ, the walls began to crack. Employees who had feared speaking out now saw safety in numbers. An anonymous tip line created by a coalition of civil rights attorneys and tech volunteers logged over 600 submissions in its first 48 hours. And then came the leak. A confidential Atlantic Airways training document surfaced online. It contained phrases like passenger profiling discretion, avoid escalation when dealing with verified elites, and most damning of all, a flowchart of suspicious behavior markers, which disproportionately aligned with cultural identifiers of Black Latinx and Muslim passengers. The document ignited firestorms across newsrooms and social feeds alike. Edward Richmond's name trended for all the wrong reasons. His decades of power, once shielded by polished sound bites and quarterly gains, were unraveling in real time. Calls for his resignation grew louder. So did the demands for sweeping reform. But Richmond backed into a corner, played one final card. He launched an aggressive counter-narrative funding op-eds and media appearances that painted Marcus as impulsive, vengeful, and disloyal to business norms. He accused Pinnacle Technologies of exploiting a personal incident for corporate gain. He wants to be a social justice CEO, Richmond sneered during a business roundtable. But his actions are destabilizing our entire sector. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Marcus was already closing the deal. By the end of that week, a quiet consortium led by Marcus had acquired 28% of Atlantic Airways stock with proxy agreements granting effective control. The final 3% came from a surprise ally, a retired airline investor who had watched his granddaughter face discrimination 2 years prior and had been waiting for someone to confront the system. With majority influence secured, Marcus called a shareholder meeting. And this time, he wasn't asking for a seat. He was taking the helm. The announcement came on a live stream watched by over 8 million people. Injustice doesn't need applause, Marcus began. It needs infrastructure. And starting today, Atlantic Airways will no longer be a safe haven for institutional bias disguised as policy. He unveiled the first steps: new oversight boards, zero-tolerance enforcement mechanisms, and whistleblower protection policies designed by those previously silenced. It wasn't just reform, it was a rebirth. Later that evening, as the media world digested the shift, Marcus sat with Eloise in her garden. Fireflies blinked above the hydrangeas. The quiet was rare and welcome. "You know what hurts most?" she asked, sipping her tea. He looked at her. "That I wasn't surprised," she whispered. "But what's healing is that now they are." Marcus nodded. The system hadn't changed yet, but it had blinked. And next, he would make sure it listened. Within days of Marcus Winter's takeover of Atlantic Airways, board leadership change stopped being theoretical. It became procedural, real, measurable. The newly formed Passenger Equity Council, chaired by Marcus himself and co-chaired by Dr. Tier. Ruth Onyele, a civil rights scholar, was granted immediate authority to audit hiring practices, passenger profiling records, and even onboard incident reports previously deemed sensitive corporate data. Everything for the first time in decades was fair game, and the council didn't just review, it acted. In its first session, the council suspended 47 internal policies for reassessment, including a flagged travelers list with no transparency or appeal process. They also terminated 2 senior HR managers who had authored behavioral escalation protocols proven to disproportionately target Black and Latino passengers. Media outlets didn't just report the story, they followed it. CBS ran a week-long investigative series titled Altitude Bias: How the Skies Were Never Equal. CNN devoted a town hall to systemic racism in corporate travel. And social platforms exploded with the hashtag #ReboardEquity as travelers across the globe began sharing stories of quiet discrimination, sudden downgrades, and whispered apologies that came too late. The airline's past long buried in NDAs and corporate secrecy was now public domain. Meanwhile, Eloise Winters became an unlikely symbol of grace and quiet defiance. Photos of her sitting in seat 12A, dignified, composed, were reprinted in Time, the New York Times, and even appeared on a mural in downtown Atlanta painted by a local artist. The caption was simple: "We belong." Yet not everyone welcomed the change. In private clubs and executive forums, murmurs of overreach grew. Some claimed Marcus was weaponizing morality against free enterprise. Anonymous op-eds emerged in business journals arguing that his reforms would discourage investment and invite chaos into orderly industries. Marcus read every one and ignored them all. Instead, he focused on the next phase: replication. "If it's just Atlantic Airways, it dies in the spotlight," he told Diana in a late-night strategy call. "We need to go wider: railways, hotels, rental car chains, anywhere dignity is taxed." So with Pinnacle's support, Marcus launched the Dignity Index, an independent nonprofit watchdog that would audit and rank transportation and hospitality companies on treatment equity. It would use anonymous traveler reports, AI-powered analytics, and third-party verifications to expose disparity and reward reform. The first report shocked the industry. Of the 20 major travel corporations reviewed, 17 received failing grades for racial equity in service delivery. 5 had incident patterns eerily similar to Atlantic's. 2 had internal emails leaked by whistleblowers within days of publication. Marcus didn't issue statements. He issued blueprints. Companies that wanted to improve weren't just told what was wrong, they were given roadmaps for rebuilding. Soon reforms began to spread. A hotel chain in Chicago restructured its front desk protocol after being flagged for racially biased upgrades. A rideshare company quietly suspended its driver rating algorithm for review after disproportionate deactivations of Black drivers came to light. At airports in Dallas, Newark, and Denver, signs appeared at boarding counters. "This facility supports the Dignity Index. You have the right to fair and equal service." Change wasn't a press release anymore. It was policy. Back at Atlantic Airways, the staff were changing too. Veterans of the old system either left or adapted. New hires, many from marginalized communities once excluded, were brought on through a restructured, equity-first talent pipeline. In-house training shifted from customer service scripts to role-played scenarios on implicit bias and restorative action. Some called it corporate wokeness. Marcus called it overdue responsibility. And through it all, Eloise remained the soul of the movement. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at Howard University's commencement. Dressed in a navy blue dress, nearly identical to the one she'd worn on that fateful flight, she stood at the podium, soft-spoken and steady. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't plan to become a symbol. I just wanted to sit in the seat my son gave me. But if my story helped even one person be treated better, then it was worth every bruise to my dignity. The crowd rose to their feet. Even Marcus, sitting off stage, blinked away emotion. But behind the applause, not everything was secure. Edward Richmond, the disgraced former CEO of Atlantic Airways, had gone silent after stepping down. But silence didn't mean surrender. Through private equity allies and industry insiders, he began to court resistance. A quiet campaign to undermine the Dignity Index, dismiss Marcus's board authority, and reclaim lost control was underway, disguised behind market stabilization initiatives. Marcus was aware. He was watching. But for now, the winds were with him. As fall settled over the country, Marcus and Eloise finally rescheduled their Paris trip. This time on the very airline that once denied her dignity, but now flew under a new flag of accountability. As the aircraft taxied down the runway, Eloise turned to her son and said, "The seat is softer now." Marcus smiled. "It's not the seat, Mom. It's the respect." Outside the window, the runway blurred as the aircraft lifted into the sky. Not just a plane, not just a destination, a symbol of what happens when dignity takes flight. 3 weeks into the reforms, the airline world was watching, but so was the old guard. In the quiet corridors of power, resentment festered. Executives who had long operated under unspoken codes now found those codes rewritten by a man who'd refused to play by the rules of discretion. Atlantic Airways' compliance office was flooded with internal reports. Employees who once stayed silent began speaking up, some out of conviction, others to protect themselves. Either way, the facade had cracked. Yet amid progress, retaliation brewed. On a Tuesday morning, Marcus entered Pinnacle Technologies' 47th floor boardroom and found Diana Chen already seated. She looked up from her tablet, eyes sharp. "4 hedge fund chairs just filed an ethics petition against you with the National Board of Directors Association," she said flatly. "They're citing misuse of power, breach of governance norms, and get this, emotional misconduct." Marcus didn't blink. "Let me guess. Anonymous sources. Tied to Edward Richmond's camp." Diana nodded. "3 of the 4 have direct holdings in transport conglomerates. They're spooked by the Dignity Index. Richmond's playing long ball now. Then we'll respond in kind." Marcus moved to the window. The skyline of the city stretched beneath him, glittering and oblivious. Somewhere below, systems were either reforming or entrenching. The petition itself held no teeth, but the media narrative it triggered did. Overnight headlines shifted from "CEO champions reform" to "Is Marcus Winters weaponizing influence?" Suddenly, talk shows debated whether Marcus had overcorrected, whether Pinnacle's values had turned into vendettas. A former airline executive appeared on cable news, accusing Marcus of using his mother's experience for optics. Another claimed this is why CEOs shouldn't get personal. Marcus watched the segments in silence. He understood this playbook. It was always the same: discredit the messenger, distort the mission, derail the movement. But this time he wasn't alone. By Thursday, over 100 CEOs of minority-owned firms signed a joint statement backing Marcus and the Dignity Index. Civil rights organizations followed. Even legacy CEOs who had once stayed neutral now began weighing in carefully but clearly. And then came the unexpected ally, Lydia Patel. The new CEO of Atlantic Airways had been quietly working in the background, auditing every line of corporate code that enabled the discrimination Eloise had faced. After terminating 13 employees and restructuring 27 policies, she held her first press conference. "I did not inherit a company," she said. "I inherited a cover-up. We will no longer be reactive. We will be accountable." Reporters pressed her about Marcus Winters. She didn't flinch. He didn't embarrass us. He revealed us. And for that, I thank him. The corporate war shifted again. But Marcus knew this wasn't just about airlines anymore. The backlash had grown sophisticated. AI-generated bots began flooding the Dignity Index review platform with false reports of reverse discrimination. Deep fake videos of Marcus making inflammatory statements began circulating in fringe spaces online. His team quickly flagged and removed them, but the damage was cumulative. Then came the leak. An internal email Marcus had written to Diana months before the flight was published by a business gossip site. In it, he had written, "I'm tired of pretending the system works when it's built to excuse itself. If we don't start disrupting the rules, we'll never change them." The quote was taken out of context, but it didn't matter. The fire had been lit. Conservative business outlets pounced. Radical CEO calls for disruption of corporate order. Anonymous think pieces accused him of trying to dismantle capitalism. One article accused him of corporate insurrection. Let them scream. Diana said trying to stay calm. It means we're hitting something real. But Marcus wasn't just thinking about damage control. He was thinking about counterbalance. "Let's go on offense," he said. "Schedule an interview, prime time. Not a puff piece of full interrogation. No talking points. Just truth." Diana hesitated. "You sure that's a high wire act? I'm done whispering in boardrooms. It's time to speak directly." The interview was scheduled for Sunday night on the most watched news magazine in the country. The studio was quiet, lights low, just Marcus and the anchor across from each other. No teleprompters, no handlers. "Mr. Winters," the anchor began, "some say you've turned a personal incident into a corporate crusade, that you've abandoned professionalism for activism. How do you respond?" Marcus looked directly into the lens. "When professionalism becomes the excuse for silence in the face of discrimination, then yes, I'll choose activism. Every time." The interview went viral within hours. Clips circulated online. Hashtags surged again. "We choose dignity, not just a seat," Winters effect. But perhaps most impactful was the final quote. "This isn't just about one airline or my mother's seat. It's about every space where people are told they don't belong. Boardrooms, classrooms, first-class cabins. I'm not dismantling anything. I'm rebuilding the foundation so it's strong enough for everyone." By the next morning, public sentiment had turned. Donations to the Dignity Index surged. Airline competitors quietly reached out to partner. And for the first time since the counteroffensive began, Marcus received a single-line message from Edward Richmond. "Well played." But Marcus didn't reply, because he knew it wasn't a game. 3 days after the interview aired, the office of the Secretary of Transportation called. Not a staffer, not a scheduler, the secretary herself. "I watched your segment twice," she said. "We'd like you to speak at the National Transportation Equity Conference next month. But more importantly, I want to pilot your Dignity Index on federal transportation contracts. Would you be open to that?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I built it for scale. Let's talk logistics." Within hours, his team was meeting with federal regulators to explore a nationwide rollout of the platform. For Marcus, this wasn't just a professional milestone. It was the clearest sign yet that what started as a defense of his mother had transformed into a movement. But with every breakthrough, the resistance only became more refined. That same week, an anonymous op-ed appeared in the Financial Chronicle titled, "The Tyranny of Outrage When CEOs Become Judges." Though it didn't name Marcus directly, the subtext was undeniable. It questioned whether corporate leaders should wield moral authority and challenged the idea of making policy through public shaming. It was elegantly written, citing historical cautionary tales and quoting selective data. But Marcus recognized the fingerprints. Richmond's legal team. They were adapting, elevating the battle from airline seats to thought leadership arenas, no longer just attacking Marcus as a man, but as an idea. Meanwhile, at Pinnacle Technologies, Diana brought him another development. "We've traced the IPs behind the bot attacks on the Dignity Index review platform," she said, sliding a report across the table. "Most of them lead back to a firm based in Luxembourg. Guess who owns a controlling stake?" Marcus read the name aloud. "KR Holdings, Richmond's shell company." Diana nodded. "We're filing a formal cyber interference claim." But before she could continue, Marcus raised a hand. Let's do more than file. He turned to his communications director. Draft a white paper, title it When Systems Strike Back. Detail every retaliation, every anonymous article, every coordinated attack. Let's show people exactly what power does when it feels threatened. He paused, then added, and publish it in Harvard Business Review. Not the news, the canon. Later that week, he stood before Pinnacle's 12,000 employees at their annual leadership summit. What had once been a standard corporate gathering now felt like a mission briefing. You've heard a lot about our fight with Atlantic Airways, he said, but make no mistake, this isn't about airlines. This is about whether corporations can still say one thing and do another. We're not just building tech anymore. We're building integrity. The applause was thunderous, but even that wasn't the moment Marcus would remember. It was what happened later when a young intern named Layla approached him nervously clutching a notepad. Mr. Winters, she said, my father worked 30 years at a rental car company and was never promoted. Trained 5 managers who leapfrogged over him. Never complained, just worked. She swallowed hard. He passed away last year. But today, for the first time, I feel like his story mattered. Marcus didn't say anything. He just put his hand over hers. And in that silence, the mission sharpened again. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. But restoration didn't mean retreat. The following Monday, Marcus arrived at the New York office of a major airline alliance, one that included Atlantic Airways and 5 other major carriers. He wasn't invited. He came anyway. Flanked by Diana and 2 legal advisors, he walked into the glass atrium and handed the receptionist a sealed packet. For your executive committee, he said. Inside is a proposal: adopt the Dignity Index as your passenger experience standard across all member airlines, or prepare for full public audit. The choice is yours. The move sent shockwaves. News outlets reported on the unprecedented ultimatum. Airline CEOs scrambled for alignment. Some called it hostile. Others called it visionary. One headline read, "Is Marcus Winters writing the rules?" In response, Marcus gave a single quote: "We've tried suggestions. Now it's time for standards." Back at Pinnacle, Diana's team was finalizing a confidential acquisition, an AI firm specializing in real-time sentiment analysis from passenger feedback, surveillance logs, and call center audio. It was the missing piece. This tech, Diana explained, lets us trace not just complaints, but patterns of dismissal. We'll see which employees ignore them, who escalates, and who buries them. Deploy it, Marcus said. She hesitated. You know they'll say we're monitoring people unfairly. He looked her in the eye. Only the ones who built their careers on the assumption no one was watching. That evening, a senior pilot from Atlantic Airways requested a private meeting. His name was David Morgan, and his voice trembled as he spoke. I've flown 11,000 hours, he said. Seen a lot, ignored more. But I'm done ignoring. I want to help fix this before the next Eloise Winters gets downgraded midair. Marcus nodded. Then help me build the first airline ethics council with employee representation. You'll be the first name on the charter. David's hand trembled as he signed. As Marcus left the building that night, he paused on the curb, watching traffic blur past. The journey had begun in silence, in a mother's shame, a son's outrage. But now it was policy, infrastructure, culture, legacy. And Marcus Winters wasn't slowing down. He was just shifting into higher gear. Marcus Winters had always known that challenging power would invite retaliation, but he hadn't anticipated how sophisticated that retaliation would become. Just a week after his surprise visit to the Airline Alliance headquarters, a memo leaked. Not from his team, not from a whistleblower, from within Pinnacle Technologies itself. The document was selectively edited, a distortion of internal emails and meeting notes. The media quickly latched on to one phrase taken grossly out of context: control the narrative before the facts can. The implication was devastating. that Marcus had orchestrated a PR campaign not for justice, but for optics. It spread like a virus quoted by morning shows dissected on political talk panels. The phrase became a hashtag twisted into mockery narrative CEO. Diana burst into his office with the original files in hand. They spliced your words. It was from a media training session about preparing for cybersecurity crises, not discrimination cases. I know, Marcus said. He had already reviewed the files twice. But the truth won't matter if we don't expose the tactic. He tapped his desk. Bring in digital integrity. Diana blinked. The forensic firm? He nodded. It's time to trace the leak and, more importantly, who it was meant to protect. While the PR storm swirled, Marcus kept moving. He met with representatives from the Department of Justice, offering his platforms to aid in investigations beyond the airline industry. We can expand bias detection across all federally regulated industries, trucking, maritime, rail, he proposed. Real-time encrypted, accountable. The Assistant Attorney General raised an eyebrow. That's ambitious. It's overdue. Back at Pinnacle, the digital integrity team uncovered something worse than expected. The leaked memo had come from a secure board channel accessed by a single device linked to someone Marcus had once trusted. Andrew Parker. Marcus sat in silence for a long moment after Diana delivered the news. I should have seen it sooner, he murmured. You were busy saving your mother and dismantling corporate racism, she replied dryly. Cut yourself a little slack. But Marcus didn't want slack. He wanted clarity. At the next board meeting he entered with printed copies of the forensic report. He said nothing. Just slid a folder in front of each member and waited. William Stewart was already gone. But Andrew was still seated near the end of the long mahogany table, thumbing his pen like it was a detonator. This, Marcus said quietly, is what betrayal looks like in a spreadsheet. Andrew shifted. You're suggesting I leaked the memo? Marcus didn't blink. The metadata confirms it. What I want to know is why. Andrew shrugged with the false calm of a man caught too cleanly to feign innocence. I believe the board deserved to know the full picture. No, Diana interjected sharply. You believed if you could muddy Marcus' integrity, you'd still have a shot at replacing him. You gambled on misinformation and lost. The board chair, Rebecca Wong, looked from Marcus to Andrew. This is your chance, Andrew. Explain yourself. Or resign. Andrew opened his mouth, closed it again, then pushed his chair back. I resign, he said simply. And just like that, the final thread of internal opposition unraveled. But outside, a new opponent was rising. The conservative political network, known as Civic Core, released a full-page editorial titled Wokeness at 30,000 Feet, Why CEOs Should Stay Out of Social Engineering. They cited Marcus by name, accusing him of weaponizing social justice to accumulate unchecked power. It wasn't just noise, it was a declaration of war. Soon a congressional subcommittee on transportation funding requested that Marcus testify under the guise of evaluating the use of AI in federal systems. Diana leaned over his desk, holding the subpoena. They're not asking, they're hunting. Marcus met her gaze. Then let's give them something worth hunting for. At the hearing, cameras flashed as Marcus took a seat. The chairperson, a senator known for grandstanding, launched the first salvo. Mr. Winters, are you aware that your company's software flagged over 1-800 airline employees for potential bias last quarter? That's nearly 6% of the workforce. Yes, Senator Marcus replied, and 94% were not flagged. But those 6% represented 83% of confirmed complaints. The room quieted. And are you suggesting we build a travel system where algorithms decide who's fair and who's not? I'm suggesting we stop pretending this system is fair to begin with. Behind him, a reporter scribbled frantically. The senator smirked. Sounds like you want to replace human judgment with machines. Marcus leaned forward. No, Senator. I want to replace unchecked bias with measurable accountability. If you'd prefer, we keep letting grandmothers like Eloise Winters get downgraded without recourse. That's a different conversation. Gasps, cameras, flash bulbs. The clip would go viral in under an hour. After the hearing, as he exited into a sea of microphones, Marcus paused to speak directly to the press. "Let me be clear," he said. "I'm not trying to create a system that punishes. I'm building one that remembers. Because the only thing worse than discrimination is pretending we forgot it happened." That night, back in his office, he finally opened a letter that had been waiting on his desk. It was handwritten. From Eloise. Just one sentence: "Don't lose your soul trying to fix theirs." He held the note for a long time, then folded it gently into his breast pocket. The war wasn't over, but neither was the mission. Not by a long shot. For Marcus Winters, silence had always been strategy. But now in the war of perception and policy, he realized something else: silence could also be a vacuum. And vacuums didn't stay empty for long. They got filled with spin distortion and carefully sanitized narratives that erased everything people like his mother had endured. So he did what CEOs rarely did. He spoke, not to a boardroom, not to shareholders, but to the people. Marcus appeared on 60 Minutes seated across from veteran journalist Helen Crawford in a room stripped of executive polish. No logos, no suits, just two chairs and the weight of uncomfortable truth. "Why now?" Helen asked. "You've led Pinnacle for years. Why choose this fight? Why make it public?" Marcus folded his hands. "Because the quiet path stopped working. Because my mother was humiliated for holding a ticket she'd earned through a lifetime of sacrifice. And because if someone like me, someone with power, stays quiet, what message does that send to those with none?" The interview aired nationwide. Ratings shattered records. It was raw, unfiltered, and it shifted the ground beneath the feet of every corporate executive hoping this storm would blow over. But the blowback came fast. That week, a shareholder group at Pinnacle Technologies, backed by conservative investors, proposed a resolution requiring board approval for any CEO to make public statements involving political or social matters on behalf of the company. It was retaliation disguised as policy. Marcus anticipated it, and so did Diana. "We're going to need a counterproposal," she said, sliding a draft across his desk. "This one affirms that ethical leadership includes responding to social injustice when it affects employees, customers, or stakeholders." "Good," Marcus said, scanning the draft. "Let's call it what it is: moral responsibility." Meanwhile, the FAA released a preliminary compliance review of Atlantic Airways, and it wasn't good. The agency confirmed procedural inconsistencies in ticketing overrides and manifest tampering across at least 3 major hubs. Multiple employees were placed on unpaid leave pending further review. The airline's interim CEO, Lydia Patel, issued a formal statement pledging unprecedented cooperation. Marcus read her statement and nodded slightly. He didn't trust many people in power. But Lydia wasn't posturing. She was rebuilding from the inside. It would take time. Still, she was the first executive to call Eloise personally and apologize. No lawyers, no PR team, just a voice on the line saying, "You were wronged and I'm sorry." But while Lydia was trying to rebuild Edward Richmond, the disgraced former CEO was quietly reassembling his influence. From the shadows, he began consulting for a lobbying firm tied to corporate deregulation. His first major move, funding a political action committee to challenge the new federal travel accountability regulations Marcus had helped propose. Their slogan, "Keep business out of backlash." It was clever, dangerous, and gaining traction. At Pinnacle, Marcus convened an emergency ethics panel with Diana and 3 outside advisors. "We need to prepare for a second wave," he said, "one that doesn't come at us through social media or shareholder meetings, but through policy sabotage." One advisor, a former civil rights attorney, leaned forward. "They'll try to make you the villain, frame your reforms as surveillance, as woke overreach, as authoritarian tech." "I know," Marcus replied. "That's why we stop being reactive. We get ahead." He authorized the expansion of AirVigil, his AI-powered bias detection platform, into a full-service division called Equitrace, not just for airlines, but for hospitals, universities, banking, anywhere bias could hide in plain sight. The announcement was met with both acclaim and alarm. Tech blogs called it revolutionary. Cable news called it controversial. The truth, it was both, because Equitrace didn't just expose discrimination, it recorded it, logged it, and published anonymized monthly data. In one pilot program, it showed that 19% of service denials in luxury retail chains occurred disproportionately to customers of color, despite identical spending history and loyalty status. It wasn't a glitch, it was a mirror, and people didn't like what they saw. At home, Eloise watched the coverage unfold with a quiet mix of pride and worry. "I hope you know," she said over dinner one night, "they're not going to stop. I'm counting on it," Marcus said. "Because the more they fight this, the more they confirm it's needed." Still, he wasn't naive. His security had been upgraded. Threats had increased, some subtle, others not. He'd been called every name imaginable in anonymous emails, including one that read, "You don't belong in first class, and you never will. You just own the jet now. We see you." He kept that one, not out of fear, but as a reminder of what the fight was really about: visibility, respect, belonging. That weekend, Marcus hosted a closed-door summit at Pinnacle with leaders from 7 major industries: aviation, tech, law, education, healthcare, logistics, and finance. All had faced public discrimination scandals in the past year. None had solved them until now. He stood at the head of the table and said, "You're not here to save face. You're here to change structure. And if that's not why you came, there's the door no one left." The work ahead was monumental, but the truth had been cracked open, and there was no closing it now. By Monday morning, Marcus Winters was no longer just a CEO, he had become a symbol. His name trended across every major platform. Some called him a hero, others accused him of weaponizing influence. But one thing was certain: the old rules of silent suffering had been shattered, and some people wanted them back. Inside the boardroom of Pinnacle Technologies, the walls buzzed with a different kind of tension. It wasn't about stock performance. Pinnacle shares were steady, even rising. It wasn't about internal revolt. His executive team stood behind him. It was about optics. "I've taken a dozen calls this morning," said Charles Dennison, the firm's global partnerships director. "Our European partners are asking if we're moving too fast with Equitrace. They're nervous." "Nervous or exposed?" Marcus asked. Dennison didn't answer. At the head of the table, Diana Chen leaned in. "Let's not forget why we started this. Every headline, every threat, it's proof we've hit something raw. That's exactly where change happens." Still, concerns were mounting. Richmond's political machine was gaining traction. The Keep Business Out of Backlash campaign had launched an aggressive PR blitz. Ads aired during primetime shows warning viewers that AI surveillance was coming to your shopping cart, your hotel, your gate. One clip showed an actor being denied service by a robot flashing red, unverified demographic risk. The message was clear: Marcus's innovations were being reframed as a dystopian overreach. And the scary part: it was working. Surveys showed public support for Equitrace dropping by 18% in 2 weeks, especially among older, affluent voters who felt targeted by reform culture. That week, Marcus flew to D.C. to speak at a bipartisan oversight hearing on AI and ethics. He had anticipated resistance, but the hostility caught even him off guard. "Mr. Winters," Senator Briggs began, peering over his glasses, "can you confirm your technology flags service workers for patterns of bias, even if the actions are unconscious?" "Yes," Marcus said calmly, "because bias doesn't require intent to cause harm. It just requires repetition. So you're punishing people for what they don't even realize they're doing?" "No. We're informing companies of patterns that need addressing. Correction isn't punishment, it's progress." Another senator jumped in. "Isn't it true, Mr. Winters, that your own platform has flagged over 2,000 micro-incidents in a single week? Doesn't that suggest your algorithm is overreaching? It suggests the system is doing what humans have failed to pay attention." He left the hearing exhausted but unshaken. Back at Pinnacle, Diana had good news. The Equitrace pilot at Halcyon Hotels just prevented a lawsuit, she said, handing him a report. A guest was being denied a room upgrade despite having elite status. The system flagged it. Front desk was retrained. Guests stayed left a glowing review. No lawsuit, no scandal. Marcus smiled faintly. Small victories mattered, even if they didn't trend. But the blowback was far from over. That Friday, an anonymous source leaked an internal email chain from Pinnacle's travel department. It revealed that some staff had flagged Marcus's mother's case to HR weeks before the incident, even before the Paris trip, but were told not to escalate perceived anomalies. It wasn't just the airline that had failed. Pinnacle had too. I didn't know, Marcus said, reading the thread. But someone in your chain of command did, Diana said. And that matters. The media jumped on it. Headlines read, "Did Pinnacle know about bias and ignore it? Justice Warrior CEO missed racism in his own house. Critics sharpened their knives." Marcus didn't flinch. He called a press conference. "We failed," he said, standing at the same podium where he'd once defended his mother. "Not in response to the incident, but in our failure to anticipate and prevent it. That ends now." He then announced that Pinnacle would undergo its own internal audit powered not by Equitrace, but by a third-party ethics firm. The findings would be made public, no redactions. When reporters asked if that was wise, Marcus answered, "It's necessary." A few days later, a new narrative emerged, one Marcus hadn't expected. Eloise. She had been invited to speak at a conference hosted by the National Association of Corporate Ethics. Just 10 minutes. But her words reached further than any executive memo. "I'm not an expert on business," she began as standing in a simple blue dress at a crowded ballroom. "But I know what it feels like to be doubted. I know what it's like to walk into a room and have your worth questioned before you've said a word." She paused. "I also know change don't come from shouting. It comes from showing, every day, every place, and from not leaving just because it gets uncomfortable." The audience stood, not out of politeness, but reverence. Later that night, Marcus replayed the clip on his phone in his office alone. He realized something. The fight wasn't just external. It wasn't just Richmond, or the media, or the Senate hearings. It was cultural inertia, the quiet, well-fed force that convinces good people to do nothing because things aren't that bad. And that was the enemy that wouldn't go down easy. Not with one victory, not with 100. But Marcus didn't need them all. He just needed one more than the system could ignore. Marcus Winters knew that the next battle wouldn't be in court or on social media, it would be in the financial trenches. While Eloise's quiet dignity had won hearts, corporate America only listened when dollars screamed. And right now, Richmond's allies were doing everything they could to make those dollars scream in the other direction. By Tuesday morning, an op-ed in the Business Ledger carried the headline, "Has Marcus Winters Become a Liability?" The piece, co-authored by a former airline executive and an anonymous Pinnacle shareholder, questioned Marcus's leadership style. It painted him as impulsive, overly emotional, and too willing to sacrifice stability for spectacle. But Marcus didn't react with fury. He responded with strategy. He called a war room session. Diana, legal, PR, and tech leads sat around a U-shaped table. At the center, a live data board scrolled analytics, market fluctuations, sentiment indices, flight data, and a rising metric, corporate resignations from Atlantic Airways affiliated vendors. "Where are we most vulnerable?" Marcus asked. "Pension funds," Diana said bluntly. "Two major institutional investors are signaling concern. Not with your ethics, but with exposure. They're afraid you've made Pinnacle a target." Marcus nodded. "Then we prove we're not the target. We're the standard." He launched Project Clarity, a full public transparency initiative. It opened Pinnacle's travel spend vendor diversity and complaint records to public scrutiny. No edits, no filters. The press called it unprecedented. Competitors called it suicidal. Investors, they called. And that's when Marcus struck back. He offered every major client of Atlantic Airways a discounted cloud package and full access to Equitrace tools for their internal operations if they severed ties with Atlantic within 60 days. 6 Fortune 100 companies signed within 72 hours. The media called it a hostile takeover of influence. Richmond called it something else off the record. Extortion, he told a reporter during an off-the-record lunch, unaware his comments were being recorded by an intern refilling water glasses. The clip leaked. The next day, the New York Journal published an editorial titled, "Calling Justice Extortion, the Last Gasp of a Dying Empire." But inside Pinnacle, not everything was stable. That afternoon, Andrew Parker resigned quietly, submitting a 2-sentence email. Marcus didn't smile. He simply marked the moment and moved forward. There were more urgent matters. Tanya Johnson, the former executive assistant turned whistleblower, was receiving threats. "They found my old address," she told Diana during a security briefing. Marcus took immediate action. He assigned Pinnacle's cybersecurity chief and physical security detail to her. He called her that night. "This isn't a favor," he said. "It's our responsibility." And that responsibility extended further. He met with the Department of Transportation to propose an independent National Flight Equity Review Board, partially funded by Pinnacle, but governed by civil rights and consumer watchdogs. "We won't just fix this in-house," Marcus told them. "We'll fix it industry-wide." One official paused and said, "No CEO's ever said that before." "Then let me be the last one who has to." By Thursday, Richmond's world was collapsing. A shareholder revolt was brewing. 4 board members resigned. 3 airlines announced plans to reevaluate their equity policies in light of growing public expectation. But Marcus wasn't gloating. He was moving. That same week, Eloise received a letter in the mail. It was from a school she had cleaned during her night shifts years ago. Inside was a certificate, honorary chairwoman, Urban Scholarship Endowment, established in your name. She called Marcus in tears. "This means more than any first-class seat," she whispered. And Marcus knew they were changing the game not just for themselves, but for people who'd never even heard their names. That Friday, Marcus convened a virtual summit titled Dignity in the Age of Data. It brought together CEOs, educators, activists, and everyday travelers. No suits required, no PR pretense, just stories and solutions. A young Latina coder shared how she built a bias detection algorithm inspired by her father being denied a seat upgrade. A Black flight attendant recounted how she was told to smile more when she tried to report passenger misconduct. A white pilot admitted he'd seen things and stayed silent for too long. And Marcus, he closed the summit with a quiet phrase: "We don't need another hero. We need a system that doesn't demand one." That quote went viral. By week's end, the conversation had shifted again, not to Marcus, not even to Eloise, but to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And that was the win that mattered most. By Monday, the dust hadn't settled, it had crystallized. What began as a single discriminatory moment at a check-in desk had now catalyzed a multi-sector transformation. But Marcus knew this moment could still slip into memory if it wasn't locked into infrastructure. He didn't want headlines, he wanted legislation. So he made the next move. Marcus flew to Washington, D.C., not in a private jet, not even in first class. He booked a commercial seat in coach. And when a surprise flight attendant offered him an upgrade, he declined. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said quietly. The purpose of his visit was clear. He had meetings scheduled with the Department of Transportation, several members of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and one very influential senator, Yolanda Figueroa. Senator Figueroa, the daughter of immigrant farm workers, had spent years fighting for transportation equity. And now she had a partner with leverage data and undeniable public momentum. In the Capitol's Hart Senate office building, Marcus slid a 12-page proposal across her desk. Title: Passenger Bill of Rights 2.0, Equity, Dignity, and Digital Accountability. She read it once, then again. Her eyes didn't blink until she reached the end. "You're not asking for a favor," she said. "No," Marcus replied. "I'm offering a framework. The framework are proposed real-time bias analytics for ticketing and seating, mandatory quarterly reporting of seating discrepancies by race and gender, whistleblower protection clauses, and a federal hotline for passenger discrimination complaints with subpoena power for patterns." "I can sponsor this," Figueroa said. "But I'll need more than your name." "You'll have it," Marcus said, "and the backing of 10 CEOs ready to testify." They shook hands. The following week, a joint press event was held outside Union Station in D.C. Senator Figueroa stood at the podium, flanked by Marcus and a coalition of corporate civil rights and travel industry leaders. A dozen cameras broadcast the announcement, "The Equity in Air Travel Act. Draft introduced." As the cameras rolled, Eloise watched from home, her hands folded in her lap. "He's rewriting the rules," she said softly. "Not just for me, for everyone." Meanwhile, inside Atlantic Airways, a different kind of rewriting was happening. Lydia Patel, now interim CEO, called an all-hands video meeting with every department head. "We're not just cleaning up a PR mess," she said. "We're dismantling a broken culture." Then she did something radical. She hired Tanya Johnson, the whistleblower, who had once been dismissed as the airline's new chief ethics officer. Her mandate, total overhaul. Tanya's first move was bold. She instituted reverse training. Executives would now be trained by frontline workers and passengers who had experienced discrimination firsthand. Captain Richard Hayes and Vanessa Whitfield, pending legal reviews, were removed permanently. But more than that, their actions became part of every onboarding training, not as cautionary tales, but as case studies of what unchecked bias looks like in practice. Marcus, meanwhile, returned to Pinnacle, but only briefly. He was on the move again, this time to university campuses. He partnered with Howard MI and Stanford to launch the Winters Initiative for Ethical Leadership, a program designed to train future executives not only in management, but in moral courage. Students would study real-world case files like the Atlantic Airways incident and propose systemic redesigns. It wasn't about inspiration, it was about incubation. "Leaders aren't born," Marcus told the first class. "They're built. And if we don't build them with values, someone else will build them with indifference." Back in the business world, corporate boards took notice. By the end of the month, 4 major airlines had adopted voluntary versions of Pinnacle's transparency protocols. Tech firms began adapting similar policies for client onboarding, and hotel chains quietly reached out to Marcus for partnership with AirVigil. They weren't doing it out of kindness. They were doing it because silence was no longer cheaper than justice. One of the most unexpected calls came from a luxury travel magazine. They wanted to name Marcus Man of the Year. He declined. Instead, he suggested they feature people who stayed seated until justice stood up. The cover featured Eloise, Tanya, and 2 anonymous passengers who had shared their stories during the press conference. No titles, just names and dignity. That image went viral. It was framed in classrooms, printed in airport lounges, shared in forums Marcus would never visit. But the real shift that happened quietly. In a Chicago terminal, a black woman in a church hat handed her boarding pass to a gate agent. He scanned it, then looked her in the eye and said warmly, "Welcome to first class, ma'am. Thank you for flying with us." She blinked surprise, then smiled. Not because she was upgraded, but because for once she didn't have to prove she belonged. That was the blueprint Marcus was building. Not just a seat, but a system that recognized your right to it. It wasn't long before Marcus Winters realized his fight had shifted once again this time, from airlines to alliances. Corporate America that was listening. But not all of it was learning. The story had shaken the aviation industry, yes, but now the tech, banking, and hospitality sectors were quietly assessing the risk of their own exposure. CEOs whispered behind closed doors, boards commissioned cultural audits, and PR firms scrambled to update crisis playbooks. But for Marcus, none of that mattered unless power changed hands. So when an invitation arrived from the National Business Leaders Council, NBLC, for Marcus to keynote their annual summit, a gathering notorious for backpatting and quiet lobbying, he surprised them. He said yes. The event was held at the Palisade Hotel in New York City. Crystal chandeliers, lobster risotto, white linen silence. The kind of room where uncomfortable truths were usually avoided with a toast. But not this time. Marcus walked to the stage in a tailored navy suit, no tie, no script, just a single sheet of notes and a conviction older than the building. He didn't talk about stock prices. He talked about his mother. He didn't present a strategy. He presented a mirror. Let me ask you something. He began, a voice steady. How many of you run companies that publicly claim to value diversity and inclusion? Hands rose. Now keep your hands raised if you've actually asked your team for seating data by race ticket upgrades, by gender customer complaint, trends by accent. Hands dropped. You say you want inclusion, but you don't measure exclusion. You say your door is open, but no one comes in because they know what happens after. The silence thickened. Then he dropped the hammer. Here's the new reality, he said. From now on, we, the people you ignored, are not knocking on your door. We're buying the building. There was no applause, just impact. After his speech, a dozen CEOs requested private meetings, some to partner, others to preempt, and a few to negotiate their own reputational insurance. Marcus listened, but he made no promises. Instead, he focused on one thing, Air Vigil. The AI-driven bias detection platform, once laughed at by traditionalists, was now a case study in every top business school. Companies were clamoring for access. So Marcus took the next step. He spun it off into an independent nonprofit with a unique model. Only companies that agreed to public transparency reporting could license the software. No more quiet cleanups. Accountability would be public or not at all. The backlash came fast. Some CEOs accused him of extortion. But then something unexpected happened. A whistleblower inside the luxury hotel chain Al Bell, one of Atlantic Airways' top hospitality partners, leaked a year's worth of discrimination complaints swept under the rug. The same day, Air Vigil flagged a pattern in their internal transportation data. Within 48 hours, Al Bell's stock dropped 11%, and the CEO called Marcus personally. I want to fix this, she said. Help me. Marcus didn't gloat. He offered a roadmap, and that's when the shift became real. The next week, 3 Fortune 100 companies announced voluntary compliance with the Winters Protocol, a 5-step blueprint for bias accountability built on data, dignity, and decentralized power. But Marcus wasn't done. He had one more room to walk into. The annual board meeting of Atlantic Airways was reconvening with new leadership, a revised code of conduct, and for the first time ever, an external review committee led by civil rights attorneys. The new CEO, Lydia Patel, invited Marcus not as an adversary, but as a stakeholder. You could have burned us to the ground, she said as they shook hands. Instead, you forced us to rebuild it better. Marcus entered the room, this time not in protest, in governance, as a board member. The walls still smelled of marble and money, but the agenda had changed. He reviewed the quarterly ethics audit, approved new DEI-linked executive bonuses, and when it came time to vote on long-term strategy, he offered this. We don't need slogans, he said. We need systems that survive leadership changes. The vote passed unanimously. That night, as Marcus walked back to his hotel, he passed a small coffee shop where a young black woman was showing her mother a video on her phone. It was of Eloise Winters smiling as she stepped into first class again, this time welcomed with respect. That's her, the girl said. She changed everything. And just as they noticed Marcus passing by, the mother called out, "Tell your mom thank you." He paused, smiled softly, and nodded. While Marcus was building momentum and gaining allies in public, Edward Richmond was quietly orchestrating a different campaign behind the scenes, a campaign of erasure. He knew he had lost the opening battle. He also knew that corporate America had a short memory. So he set out to rewrite the narrative. First, he hired one of the country's most powerful reputation management firms, people who specialize not in defending facts but in reshaping perception. Their goal was simple: bury Marcus's victory in nuanced confusion and counterclaims. They began by planning op-eds in industry publications. Did Marcus Winters overreach corporate governance versus social crusading? Can emotionally charged decisions create long-term shareholder risk? All unsigned, all subtly coordinated, all aimed to portray Marcus as brilliant but unstable, a disruptor whose actions, while understandable, had endangered the sacred temple of fiduciary duty. At the same time, whispers started in investor circles that Marcus had secretly planned the whole incident, that his mother's experience was exaggerated, that maybe it wasn't racism, it was just a clerical error blown out of proportion. It was ugly and deliberate. Then came the tech blow. A leak to financial media suggested that AirVigil's early-stage AI model might be prone to false positives and inherent bias based on cherry-picked code snippets and incomplete documentation from a disgruntled former contractor. Within 48 hours, stock analysts began questioning whether the tool was litigation bait rather than a breakthrough. Marcus is an idealist, one report said, but idealism doesn't scale. Back at Pinnacle, Diana Chen pulled the report and skimmed it grimly. "He's trying to discredit you without ever saying your name," she told Marcus. Marcus didn't flinch. "Then we respond with something he can't outmaneuver the truth audited." He assembled a team of third-party AI ethics researchers and data transparency watchdogs, people with no skin in the game, but reputations built on integrity. Within a week, they released a white paper validating AirVigil's framework as not only sound but industry-leading. The backlash to the smear campaign was swift. Even media outlets that had printed Richmond's planted stories issued quiet corrections. Analysts reversed their ratings. And Marcus, he didn't respond publicly, not yet, because he had something bigger planned. He and Diana had been quietly acquiring equity in a set of legacy aviation consulting firms, companies that provided data services, customer feedback analytics, and third-party compliance auditing to airlines. And when the moment was right, they merged those firms into Apex Resolve, a new venture aimed at transforming industry standards from the inside out. Their first contract, the Department of Transportation. When Marcus announced that Apex Resolve would lead the new federal task force on airline discrimination data, the entire industry went silent. Richmond tried to make one last move. He filed a private arbitration claim, accusing Marcus of using disproportionate influence to disrupt Atlantic's operations in a way that constituted malicious interference with contractual obligations. Translation: "You hurt my business too well and too publicly." Marcus's legal team shredded it in 3 weeks. Not only was the claim dismissed, the arbitrator cited documented patterns of unethical internal conduct at Atlantic Airways as justification for Marcus's original actions. It was over, or so it seemed, because Richmond wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in revenge. And so he shifted from the corporate boardroom to political quarters. He began donating heavily to transportation lobbying groups and think tanks focused on executive restraint. He began funding candidates quietly who would oppose regulatory expansion, like AirVigil's model being adopted at the federal level. It wasn't about undoing what had happened. It was about making sure no one like Marcus ever did it again. But what Richmond failed to understand was this: Marcus wasn't the only one watching. By now, there were dozens of executives, directors, and investors, many from historically marginalized communities, who had seen what Marcus had done. And they were building. Whistleblowers began citing his story when they came forward. Junior associates referenced his example when refusing to stay silent. Founders used his name in pitch decks to justify building equity-first business models. And when Eloise's interview with NPR aired, her voice trembling but firm as she said, "I didn't set out to change anything. I just wanted to sit where I belonged." A viral movement reignited all over again. Richmond's smear campaign had failed. But more importantly, his story had lost control. And Marcus, He hadn't said a word since the arbitration win. Until now. Washington, D.C. was not new to grandstanding. The U.S. Capitol had heard every type of voice booming, pleading cunning, and righteous. But on this morning, it heard something rare, a voice that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway. The chamber was packed. Senate Subcommittee on Transportation Oversight hearings weren't typically headline material, but today was different. Today, Marcus Winters would testify. At the center table, surrounded by microphones and flashes from press cameras, Marcus sat in a navy suit, not flashy, not performative, flanked by Diana Chen and Tanya Johnson. The nameplate in front of him read Marcus Winters, Chief Executive Officer, Pinnacle Technologies founder, Travel Equity Initiative. He didn't look like a disruptor. He looked like a man with receipts. The chairwoman tapped her gavel. This committee now calls Mr. Marcus Winters to testify regarding systemic discrimination in airline operations and customer service protocols. Marcus stood. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't shuffle papers. He looked each senator in the eye and then spoke with his tone so calm it felt like a scalpel. Senators, I'm not here because I run a Fortune 500 company. I'm here because my mother bought a first-class ticket and was told she didn't look the part. I'm here because she was humiliated, downgraded, and nearly removed from an aircraft by people who didn't ask her name, just assumed her place. And I'm here because that same thing happens quietly to people without platforms every single day. There was no posturing, just data. Marcus presented a slideshow, anonymized complaints, internal airline memos, clips of first-class passengers of color being questioned, disproportionately charts of settlements buried in arbitration. Then he paused. We don't need more apologies, he said. We need infrastructure. He clicked once more. A new slide, the Traveler Fairness Act, drafted in partnership with civil rights organizations, data scientists, and aviation experts. The proposed bill included mandatory bias reporting dashboards for all U.S. airlines, randomized audits of customer service interactions, passenger appeals process for onboard decisions, federal funding for AI-powered fairness tools developed in open-source consortiums, a clause to ban non-disclosure agreements in discrimination settlements. A hush spread across the chamber. Senator Vickers from Texas leaned forward. Mr. Winters, you're suggesting federal involvement in private sector customer interactions. Isn't that a slippery slope? Marcus didn't blink. Senator, if the private sector could self-regulate bias, my mother would have had her orange juice in first class, not tears in row 12A. Gasps, subtle but present. Senator DeMarco from Illinois added, you're not just asking for reform, you're asking for revolution. No, Senator Marcus replied, I'm asking for something more radical than revolution accountability. It wasn't just his words, it was how he said them. The room wasn't used to power wielded this way. Silent, surgical, uncompromising. After the hearing, media outlets exploded. Winters proposes historic anti-bias legislation in air travel. From CEO to civil rights catalyst Marcus Winters and the next frontier of equality. Back at Pinnacle Technologies, the phones rang nonstop. New partnerships, requests for collaborations, universities asking for him to guest lecture, civil rights groups offering research support, and quietly 3 more whistleblowers came forward from other airlines. But in the shadows, the pushback began. A new PAC funded by aviation lobbying groups began smearing the bill as corporate overreach. Opinion pieces warned about weaponizing customer service complaints. One anonymous executive told a journalist, he's trying to turn airlines into courtrooms. Marcus didn't flinch. He had expected all of it. And while the public marveled at the legislative proposal, Marcus focused on the part they didn't see: the system-wide data pipeline his engineers were building, one that would force every airline to confront the patterns they could no longer hide. That night, back at his apartment, he opened his inbox. There was a message from an airline employee. No name, no subject, just a line. We saw what happened. We've been waiting for someone like you. He closed the laptop and stared out the window toward the quiet city lights. This wasn't just a campaign. It was a blueprint. 2 weeks after Marcus Winters stood before Congress, the airline industry was in a state of suspended animation. Executives watched nervously. Investors held their breath. Lobbyists scrambled. Everyone waited for someone to blink first. And then one did. It wasn't Atlantic Airways. It wasn't any of the giants. It was Aurora Skies, a mid-sized West Coast-based airline known for eco-conscious branding and luxury lounges in Portland and Vancouver. For years, Aurora had hovered just beneath the radar, profitable, respected, but never dominant. That was about to change. Their CEO, Rhea Dewan, a former aerospace engineer turned operations mastermind, called a press conference. There were no elaborate banners, no gimmicks, just her, a podium, a screen, and 6 words projected behind her. We were wrong, we're listening now. I watched what happened to Mrs. Winters. Rhea began her voice steady, and then I read what Mr. Winters uncovered. And I did what every CEO in this industry should have done years ago. I looked inward. She paused, and I didn't like what I found. She proceeded to list findings from an internal audit. 19 flagged incidents over 12 months where non-white first-class passengers were questioned more intensely than their white counterparts. A pattern of customer complaints citing tone attitude and unusual travel profile overwhelmingly attached to minority passengers. Internal chat logs showing staff joking about passengers being too comfortable in luxury seats. These are not outliers, Rhea said. These are signals of a culture we failed to monitor. Then came the moment no one expected. Aurora Skies formally supports the Traveler Fairness Act. Gasps erupted from the room. Cameras flashed. Journalists whispered into their phones. Rhea pressed forward. We have signed on to partner with Pinnacle Technologies and the Travel Equity Initiative to implement AirVigil, the same AI bias detection platform used by Marcus Winters' firm to monitor and audit our service interactions in real time. The screen behind her updated with Aurora's new commitments. Transparent dashboards updated monthly for passenger experience metrics by race, gender, and ability. Mandatory annual training designed by equity scholars and behavioral scientists, not HR contractors. A board seat offered to an independent equity watchdog from outside the aviation sector. It was a bombshell, and it worked. Within 24 hours, Aurora Skies stock rose 8.4%. Delta Horizon and Coastlink issued vague statements about reviewing their own practices. Atlantic Airways remained silent. Marcus watched the announcement from the glass conference room of Pinnacle Tower, flanked by Diana and Tanya. He didn't smile, but he stood. She's going to take heat for this, Tanya said. She knows, Marcus replied, and she did it anyway. That afternoon, he made the call. Rhea, it's Marcus. You didn't just speak up. You moved. And now we both have to hold the line, she answered. Behind the scenes, battle lines were shifting. Atlantic's board was fracturing. 2 directors had already resigned. A group of shareholders filed a motion to install Marcus on an emergency ethics advisory panel. Meanwhile, an internal memo from the Department of Transportation leaked, confirming a multi-agency investigation into discriminatory profiling across 5 airlines. But none of that shook Marcus. He was playing a longer game. That evening, Aurora Skies posted a simple video. A black woman boarding a plane. A flight attendant greets her with her name. Her seat awaits first class. No drama, just dignity. As she sits, the screen fades to black. Text appears. This is what normal should look like. Aurora Skies. Rewriting the skies. Together. The internet exploded, but Marcus didn't join the applause. Not yet. He went back to work analyzing audit code reviewing, whistleblower updates, finalizing Phase 2 of AirVigil cross-airline accountability protocols that would force competitors to adopt the same transparency or be left behind. Because one airline defecting was a spark. But the fire that was still coming. It began with a ripple, Aurora Sky's announcement bold and unflinching. But in less than 72 hours, that ripple became a wave. What started as a reckoning was now turning into a realignment. At Atlantic Airways headquarters, emergency meetings ran around the clock. Investor calls turned from concern to fury. 12 major clients, including two pharmaceutical conglomerates and a luxury consulting firm, pulled out of long-term corporate contracts. Their reason: we no longer do business with companies that punish dignity. Meanwhile, Marcus Winters wasn't waiting. He was building. Inside Pinnacle Technologies, the Air Vigil team was working at full capacity. Data scientists fine-tuned the bias detection algorithms, while behavioral experts shaped response frameworks for airline partners. Tanya Johnson had taken on the role of Director of Passenger Equity, and under her leadership, new features were being introduced. Live passenger bias alerts for on-duty supervisors. Post-flight equity scorecards sent to every flyer offering transparency and accountability. A whistleblower upload portal protected by federal compliance encryption. Then something extraordinary happened. SkyCentric, one of the largest airline booking platforms in the U.S., announced they would begin flagging airlines under active discrimination investigations. Passengers logging on to book travel would now see a tag "Airline" under the federal review for bias-related incidents. Click for more info. It was unprecedented. And it worked. Flight bookings for Atlantic Airways plummeted 41% in 1 week. Marcus knew the movement couldn't rest on backlash alone. It needed architecture, infrastructure that survived outrage. So in partnership with legal firms, equity nonprofits, and university think tanks, he launched the Traveler's Dignity Accord. It was a charter part pledge, part framework signed by airlines willing to commit to measurable anti-discrimination practices, annual third-party audits, and real passenger restitution. Within 5 days, Aurora Sky's Jet Nimbus, Aero Connect, and a surprise entrant, Sky Japan, signed on. More importantly, Pinnacle Technologies committed $25 million to help airlines implement reforms, removing cost as an excuse. But the most powerful blow was yet to come. CNN's evening special aired a 90-minute segment titled "She Wasn't Supposed to Be in First Class." It featured side-by-side interviews with passengers who had experienced discrimination, former airline employees who had witnessed the pattern, and Eloise Winters herself. She spoke softly but firmly. "I didn't expect justice. I only hoped for decency. What I got was a son who decided neither was optional." Her words didn't just trend, they transcended. Within 24 hours, the Department of Transportation launched a full audit into Atlantic Airways' customer treatment patterns over the past decade. Marcus was notified via encrypted line that they were requesting Air Vigil's assistance in constructing the audit protocol. "You've done what we couldn't," the investigator admitted. "You built tools. Now let's use them." Meanwhile, in Atlanta, Edward Richmond met with crisis attorneys. He still believed he could wait out the fire, but the fire didn't wait for him. A second airline CEO resigned under pressure from shareholders citing failure to adapt to ethical expectations. A coalition of Black business leaders demanded a meeting with FAA executives, citing the Winters case as the catalyst of a generational grievance. And then came the spark no one expected. Delta Airlines broke silence. Their CEO, William Cho, gave a speech at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Summit. "This isn't political, this is moral. If people don't feel safe in your skies, they won't fly them. If they don't feel seen, they won't stay loyal." We've watched Marcus Winters do what this industry refused to tell the truth. He paused. Then he said it. Delta signs a Traveler's Dignity Accord, and as of this week, Air Vigil will be deployed on all U.S. flights. The room burst into stunned applause. Delta's stock surged 7% overnight. Atlantic's plummeted another 13%. Within 1 month, 6 more carriers joined. It was happening. Change wasn't just possible. It was in motion. Marcus stood at the 50th floor window of Pinnacle Tower, looking down at the glittering city. In his hand was the official partnership contract from Delta. On his desk, an invitation to address the World Aviation Ethics Summit in Zurich. Behind him, Diana walked in holding her tablet. "We just got confirmation," she said. "The FAA wants to make AirVigil the national standard for all commercial flights by next year." He didn't smile, but he nodded. "Then we better build fast," he replied, because Marcus Winters wasn't chasing applause. He was rewriting altitude with accountability. A week after Delta's historic announcement, the aviation world was unrecognizable. Airport lounges buzzed not with idle gossip, but with talk of audits, reforms, and change, real change. At the heart of it stood Marcus Winters, not with a megaphone, but with a blueprint. The Traveler's Dignity Accord had become more than a pledge. It was the new standard. By now, 8 major airlines had signed on. 3 international carriers had joined after pressure from their U.S. business clients. And the Department of Transportation had officially adopted AirVigil as part of their compliance architecture. Carriers that refused risked losing federal contracts, a financial death sentence in commercial aviation. But Marcus didn't just want reactive compliance. He wanted proactive evolution. That's why on a Tuesday morning, he walked into the headquarters of Atlantic Airways, flanked by Diana Chen and Tanya Johnson. Eloise didn't come not because she wasn't invited, but because she had gardening to do. Marcus smiled at that. She had already done the heavy lifting. The executive suite was sterile, quiet, anxious. Edward Richmond, of course, was gone. Lydia Patel, the new CEO, welcomed him. She had inherited scorched earth and was determined to cultivate something new. "Let's speak plainly," she said. "We've failed. You exposed it. Now help us rebuild it." They met for 4 hours. By the end, the terms were agreed. AirVigil would be integrated across all Atlantic operations. Tanya Johnson would serve as an external ethics advisor, reporting directly to the board. Atlantic would establish a $100 million restitution fund for past victims of discrimination. And most radically, first-class upgrades would no longer be at the sole discretion of gate agents. A new system, anonymized and monitored for bias, would ensure fairness. "Truth doesn't need discretion," Marcus said in the meeting. "It needs daylight." Meanwhile, the press narrative shifted. No longer about outrage, it was about transformation. Fast Company named Pinnacle Technologies Company of the Year. Fortune ran a cover story, "The Man Who Made First Class for Everyone." And Forbes listed Eloise Winters in their Women Who Changed business feature. But the real change wasn't in headlines. It was in hallways. Airport terminals now displayed signage that read, "Every seat deserves respect. Every passenger dignity." Proud partner of the Traveler's Dignity Accord, flight crews received new training not just in protocol, but in history. Stories of passengers like Eloise were now part of orientation. Case studies of what went wrong and how it was fixed. Airlines were no longer just teaching customer service. They were teaching humanity. Then came the summit. At the World Aviation Ethics Conference in Zurich, Marcus delivered the keynote address. He didn't bring slides. He brought silence. The audience waited as he stood on stage for nearly 30 seconds before speaking. "When my mother was asked to move to premium economy, they didn't just move her seat," he said. "They tried to move her place in society. She didn't let them. I didn't either. And now none of you will ever again." Applause. Thunderous, emotional, unified. After the conference, airline CEOs lined up to meet him, not out of obligation but respect. What he'd built wasn't just a system, it was a movement. And that movement had real teeth. The FAA released its first quarterly report under AirVigil's oversight. The findings: bias-related complaints down 62%, wrongful downgrades down 71%, customer satisfaction among minority passengers up 44%. It was working. Even better, the travel equity initiative Marcus had seeded now included corporate partnerships with over 50 companies, from rideshare giants to hotel chains. The principles of air vigil were expanding beyond airplanes, and still Marcus remained measured. "I'm not interested in applause," he told CNN. "I'm interested in systems that don't need fixing twice." He wasn't alone. Noah Reed, the young vlogger who first filmed the Eloise incident, had launched a YouTube series titled Altitude and Equity, documenting travel bias worldwide. Mia Zhang, the influencer who streamed the cabin chaos, had pivoted to become a full-time advocate for travel reform. Both had been offered seats on the new Federal Passenger Rights Advisory Council. They'd started as witnesses. Now they were architects. But not everyone was thrilled. A handful of airlines resisted. A few claimed the changes were too fast, too political, too expensive. But the market corrected them. Customers voted with their wallets. Investors voted with their dollars. Ethics, it turned out, were profitable. And so 6 months after Eloise had been removed from her seat, the last major U.S. airline signed the accord. It was a quiet press release, but its meaning was thunderous. No more discretion, no more erasure, no more pretending first class meant first come, first judged. The industry had changed. Marcus didn't call a press conference. He simply sent his mother a message. They signed. She replied with a photo. It was her boarding a flight. Same navy blue dress, same grace. Seat 1A. The air was crisp over Paris as Marcus Winters stood beneath the early morning glow of the Eiffel Tower, his mother's hand wrapped gently around his arm. Tourists bustled behind them, snapping selfies, sipping espresso. But for Marcus and Eloise, the moment wasn't about sightseeing. It was about arrival, not just to a city, but to a new era. 6 months ago, she had been told she didn't belong in first class. Today, she stood here because her presence had redefined what belonging meant. As the camera crew from the international press captured footage of Eloise Winters, smiling modestly beside her son, the video feed cut to a montage that would be seen in thousands of airports, schools, and boardrooms around the world. A gate agent gently assisting an elderly black man into seat 1C with a respectful nod. Airline staff training in a seminar room with Eloise's image on the screen and the words, "Dignity is not a luxury." Noah Reed reporting from Johannesburg about bias reform in international travel protocols. Tanya Johnson being sworn in before Congress to testify on ethical transportation oversight. AirVigil, the AI-powered system that had started in one CEO's phone, was now active in over 17 countries, flagging incidents in real time, requiring review by human ethics officers, and in some cases triggering immediate intervention. It had become a standard not of surveillance but of accountability. Marcus didn't stop at Atlantic Airways. He worked with leaders in rail crews and hospitality industries. And he refused honorary awards or glossy accolades. "This isn't about heroism," he said to the Harvard Business School graduating class. "It's about structure. Systems create injustice, and only better systems can dismantle it." Pinnacle Technologies, under his leadership, launched the Public Trust Index, a data-driven report card for every company in its vendor network, scoring businesses not just on profitability, but on human ethics, inclusion metrics, and behavioral transparency. In 6 months, that index reshaped $2.4 billion on corporate spending. Because for the first time, major clients could see where discrimination lived in boardrooms, in gate policies, and service scripts. And they could do something about it. As for Atlantic Airways, they didn't just survive, they evolved. A 3-year commitment to bias-free hiring pipelines. An internal ethics council chaired by Tanya Johnson. Regular public disclosures of progress reports. A net increase in customer loyalty, particularly among historically marginalized groups. Because real accountability breeds trust, the kind of trust that doesn't need fine print. And in the middle of it all, Eloise Winters kept her promise. She flew. Not just to Paris, but to Morocco, Sao Paulo, and Tokyo. Each time she did it with quiet pride and without being questioned, downgraded, or erased. On one of her flights, a young black girl in a school uniform approached her midair. "Excuse me," she said shyly. Are you her, the woman who changed everything? Eloise smiled, nodded, and gently replied, no, sweetheart. We changed everything. Together. Because that's the truth of legacy. It's not about what we earn, but what we leave behind. When injustice happens, in silence it grows. But when dignity answers with structure and strategy, it wins. From one seat, from one woman, from one refusal to shrink, the system changed. So the next time someone asks, is this your seat? You'll know the answer doesn't depend on perception, skin color, or status. It depends on truth. And the truth is simple. Everyone belongs where dignity is served. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching and see you next time.